Hi guys, thank you for clicking on this video. My name's Aisha and this is aishaleeanntalks. So today's video is going to be quite a horrific one. We are going to be talking about the Dozier School for boys and some of the really horrific things that happen there. Now here's your trigger warning, as there are with all of my videos, a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about the abuse, the torture, the rape and the murder of some young boys. The Dozier School for Boys was a reform school that was opened on the 1st of January 1900 in Marianna, Florida. This school continued running for over 100 years, despite multiple failed inspections and many allegations of abuse and misconduct there. The school was only closed down in 2011. The school gained a reputation for some horrific abuse, torture, rape, and murder of the boys that they were supposed to be protecting and looking after there. The Florida School for Boys, which it was named to begin with, was open to house what they called naughty kids. But these naughty kids could be boys that had been sent there for anything from abusing another child to smoking a cigarette or bunking off a school. It was even said that there were orphans there, and the boys there could be as young as 5 or 6. Now this is obviously at the very beginning and earlier years. As the school progressed, things did change a little bit and they were housing more of the naughtier boys as opposed to the orphans. But at the beginning, 5 or 6 years old being sent to this reform school must have been awful. The site was an open campus with no perimeter fencing, which from what I can tell was just surrounded mostly by forest. Initially, the site was divided into 2 sub-campuses. So you had one side which was for the white boys and one side which was for the black boys, because back then racism was, at its height. The school remained segregated until 1966. Due to there being no perimeter fencing, in 1929 there was a detention block built, which was supposed to basically house the worst of the worst kids there. It had like cells and stuff. The students ended up calling it the White House, and this building was ultimately the place where the most brutal of the brutal beatings occurred. But this didn't actually stop the boys trying to run away from the school. There were actually 169 documented escapes from the school, none of which have actually been properly verified. So knowing what we know about the school now, I'd say that was pretty suspicious. It's been reported that the school actually had dogs, which when the boys would escape, they would set the dogs on them. And rather than, get the dogs to look for them, they were actually setting the dogs on them and getting them to rip the boys to pieces. And it's said that the staff there would actually try and, convince the boys to run away, or would allow them to run away, or encourage this behaviour, just so that they could actually chase them down and shoot them, beat them, do horrific things to them. It is really awful, some of the things that have happened in the school. It's also been said that the townspeople that were in the town nearby would actually assist in the capture of the students. So when the students would try and run away or, whatever, the townspeople would actually capture them and bring them back. Call the police, yeah, we found your young boy, come and get him. So many people believe that the townsfolk were actually quite complicit in what were going on at Dozier, and that actually a lot of them knew what was going on at Dozier. As early as 1903, so 3 years after the school had opened, it was reported that children were being held up with leg irons and chained to the walls and already being quite severely beaten. The school was actually investigated 6 times in its first 13 years of opening. In 1912, it was noted that the superintendent was in the habit of brutally beating his charges, that there was nowhere to adequately care for the sick, and that the whole school had no heating. Skipping forward a little bit here, but obviously we will go back. In 2019, Dozier failed their state inspection, and an investigation was launched to look into the many allegations of abuse and mistreatment at the school. In 2011, the school was closed down. Following the closure of the school, they found the graves of over 50 children. There was a graveyard actually on the premises of this school called the Boot Hill Cemetery, which is where some of the bodies and the graves were found. but actually most of the graves were found elsewhere on the grounds. The graves in the Boot Hill Cemetery were all marked with a cross, and the crosses were put in rows. There were all these little nice little neat rows of crosses, and underneath the ground the graves were just a shambles. Recorded burials happened at the school between 1914 and 1952, but most of the records are actually missing. In 1912, there was a fire at the school in one of the dormitories. Now, the dormitories were these big brick buildings, and all the doors had been locked. So 6 of the children and 2 of the staff members actually burned to death in the blaze. In 1918, 11 of the students were recorded to have died from the Spanish flu. So this does account for most of the graves in the graveyard, but this does not account for the however many graves were found elsewhere in the grounds. One report said that in 1934, a perfectly healthy 13-year-old boy was sent to Dozier for the crime of trespassing. Within 38 days of being there, he was dead. So, what actually happened at the Dozier School for Boys? Well, there's actually a considerably large group of men, like 300, 400 men, that have come forward that were at the school in the 1950s and the 1960s. They have been dubbed the White House Boys. Now, these people have come forward to the media and told their stories and, shed light on what has actually happened at the school. So by listening to their stories and piecing it all together, we can get a good idea of what actually happened at this school. So when the boys were sent to Dozier, some of them would say that when they first stepped up to the school, it looked beautiful and everything was well kept and it looked really nice. And then as soon as you stepped in the doors, it all changed and it stank and it was cold and it was just not a nice place to be. It said that when the boys first went in, they would shave their heads. They would spray them with insecticide to make sure that they didn't have any lice. They would strip them of their clothes and they would be sent for a physical and some vaccinations. One of the boys recounted that while he was standing in the queue to see the doctor, all the boys were completely naked. One of the young boys randomly got hard down there. Now, we know that this can happen at the most inappropriate times. It does. Poor boys. And one of the doctors walked past him and grabbed hold of it and pulled on it and laughed at him. And then when the young boy went in for his physical, the doctor wanted to touch him and the boy freaked out, had a complete panic, was crying, was really upset, really emotional, really traumatized. And rather than try and comfort this young boy, the doctor slapped him in the face and shouted at him. So straight away, you walk in the doors and this place is already, what the fuck? So once you've had your physical and had your vaccinations, the boys would then be given their clothes. To begin with, they'd all be given the same clothes. They'd be given a white t-shirt and with blue trousers. If the boys asked their parents, they could get their parents to send their own clothes in, but to begin with, all the boys were given the same clothes. The rules there were incredibly strict. The boys could be beaten for the slightest infraction, like polishing their boots wrong. Or, if the white boys spoke to the black boys, they both get beaten. They both get taken down the White House and they would be beaten. The boys say that the beatings in the White House were the worst beatings that they've ever received in their lives. Now, I'm about to tell you what goes on in the White House. This is some horrific details. So if you don't want to hear the details of the actual beatings, please skip forward because the details are quite horrific. So if you got sent to the White House, you would be taken through the doors and told to queue up outside the room. While you're queuing, you would listen to the cracks, the bangs, the whips, the screams, the begs, the cries. It's been reported that some boys would cry for their mummy. Like, hearing that made me want to cry. Once one beating had finished, the boy would be told to leave and he'd leave the room bloodied and bruised and absolutely horrific, white as a ghost. and the man in the room would shout next, and the next boy would go in to receive his beating. It said that when you got to the front of that queue, you would feel absolutely sick with fright. You'd walk into this cold, windowless room. The walls were smeared with blood, and in the middle of the room was a bed, and the smell of vomit and blood was overpowering. Most of the boys that were there in the 50s and the 60s, they remember the same one-armed man named Troy Tidwell, who was apparently one of the most terrifying people in there. It said that this man was very, 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 very strong, and that even with just his one arm, he could pick up a 13-year-old boy by the throat and throw him down on the bed quite easily. Like, a one arm, that must be, again, terrifying. This one-armed man, or whoever else it was that was, inflicting these beatings, because it wasn't always the one-armed man, it could be other people, but most of them recount this one-armed man because, who's not going to fucking remember that? But he would tell you to bend over on this bed and hold on to the bars. Do not make a sound or it will be worse. If you were to move or you were to struggle, they would shout for another staff member who would come and pin you down and hold you there for your beating. Most of the beatings were carried out with a 3-foot-long leather and metal strap, which the boys said resembled a barber strap. Ex-students say that they could remember being on that bed and hearing the shuffle of the feet and then the crack of the whip on the ceiling before they felt it come down on them. And they said it would hit anywhere from above the knees to the middle of the back. The boys would bite down on a blood and vomit soaked pillow that was on the bed, and they would be beaten so severely that a lot of the time they would lose consciousness, and their clothes that they were wearing at the time would become embedded into their flesh. It's also said that there was a very loud fan that was put on in the White House or near the White House. So its purpose was basically just to muffle the screams of the boys as they were being beaten. A couple of boys have said that the staff would actually wait and come and wake you from your sleep, wake you up and drag you down to the White House for a beating. And this would be done for, like I say, any minor infraction. It didn't have to be anything massive. As I said, they could have polished their boots wrong and they're being dragged down to the White House for a beating for it. And of course, many of these boys have now been left with lifelong scars, both mental and physical, from these beatings. I mean, who wouldn't be absolutely scarred for life from that? The staff apparently would even go on to brag about the beatings and have bragged with each other about how badly they'd beaten this one and how badly this one screamed. And it's really, really sad and really horrific, some of the stories that the boys have told. In doing my research, I have actually found a clip, because as I say, this happened not that long ago, so the people that were in charge of the school at that time were still alive when the school was closed down. And I found a clip from a deposition from Troy Tidwell, the one-armed man.
Mr. Tidwell, we're ready to resume. Are you ready?
Yeah.
I think that when we took a break, we were talking about the spanking procedures and what took place in the White House, and I'd like to resume talking about that. When the boys will be taken to the White House, what were they wearing?
That depends.
And on what?
If you were working on a crew, you'd have your clothes on. Sometimes if the situation arises in a cottage at night, where if a boy was spanked, he would be in his pajamas.
If they were brought there wearing clothes from work, before they would be spanked, were they required to drop their pants?
Never.
Okay, so the boys that came from work would be spanked face down on the bed wearing their pants, correct?
Right.
And the boys that came from the cottages at night would be wearing their pajama bottoms.
Yes. And, of course, briefs underneath.
Now, do you remember the names of any of the boys that you spanked?
I would really have to think hard to remember.
How would you decide whether it would be you or Mr. Hatton that would...
That would be up to him. If he asked me to do it or told me to do it, that's when I'll use the strap.
The way he talks about the beatings, how he's downplaying it, and, you know, well, you can see how he's talking about it, it just brings a chill down my spine. And this next clip is the superintendent who was in charge of the school around this sort of time, who also inflicted a lot of the beatings.
Lennox Williams was the superintendent at the school from 1967 to 1982. Though Williams said whipping the boys was awkward and joyless for him, he also found it necessary to maintain control.
I've heard him say I was spanked, and I was glad I was spanked. And I've heard him say just the opposite. I've had old-timers come back that I never knew, and they would say what it did for them. They would say, well, I went to the White House, but I needed it. I got what I needed. It straightened me out. And then, of course, some of the others. And you can damage a child by spanking them. Even though I knew that it was helping some of them, I didn't know which ones it was helping and which ones it wasn't. That's what bothered me.
It's actually sickening to listen to when you hear the accounts from the boys of the abuse and the torture that happened to them there. One of the boys said that he had been beaten at the White House over 11 times and that he had received over 250 lashes. But more disturbingly is an account of one of the boys who says that he was whipped with that leather strap 100 times in one sitting for trying to run away. He then, 2 days later, still could not sit down. He had to go to the infirmary to go and see the doctor and found out that he had actually had a broken coccyx, and that poor boy could not sit down for another 2 months. Then, following this incident, the staff began putting Thorazine, which, from what I understand, is a sedative, which is used to treat major mental health problems. They were putting this in his food, basically just to keep him compliant. This boy claims that the punishments were not the same for all. If a boy didn't receive any visitors, he would be beaten much more severely because there was nobody that he could go and report it to. Another one of the boys says that he was working with the doctor and that a boy came into the infirmary and he was asked to clean him up. He was red, bloodied, bruised, in a horrific state, absolutely terrified, shaking and grabbing onto this boy's arm, crying and begging for help. 2 days later, this poor young little boy who was absolutely petrified disappeared, never to be seen again. But the boys were always told never to ask questions, so nobody really knew for sure what had happened to the boys that disappeared. They could only speculate, but it's believed that the staff have basically essentially murdered quite a lot of children. One of the boys said that he had overheard a conversation between two of the staff members where they were talking and laughing about how they had thrown one of the boys in the swamp to die. There's another boy who said that he witnessed the staff putting a young boy into one of the big laundry dryers and putting it on. This boy was obviously presumed to be dead after that incident. Another one of the boys says that one of the staff members woke him up in the middle of the night with another boy and took these two boys out into the forest and told them to dig a hole. They said to dig it 4 foot deep, and when the boys asked, "How big?" they said, "Big enough for a boy." There have been so many accounts of abuse and torture and just, the horrific mistreatment of the boys. This, again, is another horrific story, horrific account, including sexual assault. So if you don't want to hear this, skip forward. This same boy who worked with the doctors, recounted some really horrific abuse. He claims that one of the staff members came up behind him and put their hand over his mouth, dragged him into a dark room and began beating him and pinning him and doing some really horrific things to him. He says he remembers feeling the man's knees digging into his back at one point. And once this young boy finally gave up and became compliant, this staff member sexually assaulted him. It's been said that there was a room that's been described as a dungeon below the cafeteria, which the students called the rape room, where boys as young as 9 years old were being taken and sexually abused. Not only were these boys being beaten and abused and tortured, they were also being used as slave labour. They were being forced to work to make the school money. The school would actually hire out the students and let them leave campus to go and work on other farms. With racism being as prevalent as it was back then, the white boys got the better jobs, the black boys got the manual labour jobs like working in fields. You know, the white boys would actually learn kind of skills like bricklaying and things like this, where the black boys, yeah, you're just doing the manual labour, you're mowing the fields, you know, you're yeah, not nice. The school had a dairy farm, a printing press, a bricklaying facility. They had loads of different things in there, all of which were designed to make money. They weren't just supplying the school with food, they were supplying the whole town. And because of all this exploitation that was going on in the school are making quite a lot of money. So they're like, oh, what can we do? We should bring some more boys in. You know, the more boys we have, the more money we make. Of course, that's the mentality of companies nowadays. You know, more money. So the school very quickly became overcrowded. This school that was supposed to house maybe 150, 200 a push was housing over 500 people. And every once in a while, the boys were made to write home to their families. But all of these letters were monitored. Every letter that went in or out of that place was read by the staff. And if you tried to disclose anything that was happening to you there, you would get beaten. Your letter would not be sent and you would be made to rewrite it. In 1967, corporal punishment was banned and the White House was closed down and supposedly just used for storage. Now, this being said, that does not mean that the torture and the horrific things that were happening to the boys ended. No, it did not. In 1968, a Florida governor went and visited the school, and he said after he found some poor conditions and some severe overcrowding, somebody should have blown the whistle a long time ago. At this time, this school that shouldn't house any more than like 150 to 200 students was housing 564 students. Some of the boys just for minor offences such as truancy or trespassing or, you know, things like this, and others for much more horrific crimes. In the late 20th century, former students that had been held at the school between the 50s and 60s began coming forward and recounting their stories of abuse. They then banded all together and created a group which they called the White House Boys. The group now has over 400 members. Over 300 of those people have recounted abuse happening to them personally, and others have recounted abuse that they've witnessed. One of the men said when he was talking about the group, the White House Boys, "My brother passed away. He had heard something about it on the news, and the more we heard about it, a group was formed called the Official White House Boys. We would have a yearly meeting, and it was helpful telling our stories to each other and having something positive come out of something so evil." They also then began to try and challenge the state to actually investigate the staff and the practices that were happening at the school. In 2008, in response to the allegations from the White House Boys, the White House was closed and completely sealed, and a commemorative plaque was placed on it. In February 2010, the White House filed a lawsuit for damages for what had happened to them at the school, but unfortunately this was dismissed because the statute of limitations had ran out, so after everything, the boys are going to receive nothing. The state publicly apologised to 24 of the victims and families. They actually did a whole ceremony and named every one of these people and publicly apologised to 24 people. The rest was just not even acknowledged. The following month, it was then announced that no criminal charges would be being brought forward because Apparently, there was no way that they could prove or disprove any criminal wrongdoing, even though there's blood all over the walls inside the White House. They have all of these witness accounts. But they can't prove any wrongdoing. Okay. My head can't get around that. And Tidwell, the one-armed man, he only died recently. He was in his 90s. So, like, they really could have brought charges forward on these people, but they haven't. But if all of this happened in the 50s and the 60s, then how come once the corporal punishment was banned, things didn't change? Or enough so that the school didn't end up being closed down? Well, in 1982, an inspection found that the boys were being hogtied, which means they were being tied with their hands behind their back, their hands then attached to their feet and left on their bellies for hours at a time. The boys were being tied up and hung to bars in their cells and left hanging there like this for hours and hours and hours on end. And they were also being kept in long periods of isolation. And apparently these were all approved practices and they were routine. The ACLU filed a lawsuit over this and similar mistreatment and malpractices in 3 other state schools as well. In 1994, the school was taken over by a new corporation, and at this time the school was housing 134 students, most of which were there for violent and quite severe crimes. And it was around this time, I'm not exactly sure when, but at some point around this time, the school was then surrounded by a fence and it became quite a high-risk facility. So it's now more like a prison as opposed to a school. But the students, or the boys that were there at this time, were from the ages of 13 to 16 or 17. In 2007, the acting superintendent and another one of the employees at the school was fired for allegations of abuse towards the students. So the abuse was still going on in 2007. In late 2009, the school failed an inspection and it was found that among many other problems, they had completely failed to deal with any of the complaints of allegations of abuse. And there were numerous complaints of continued mistreatment. It's been said that the school was struggling to move on from a long-standing culture of abuse and violence. Move on from it. Don't you mean stop it? I mean, it's still happening. It was still happening. They say this like this is something that happened a long time ago. Yeah, the whippings and beatings might have happened a while ago, but the abuse was still very much happening right up until the school was closed down. So following this, the governor ordered a complete full inspection into the school, and according to a report in 2010, 11.5% of the boys that were surveyed at the school say that they had experienced sexual abuse with force by a staff member in the last 12 months. 10.3% of the boys state that they have been subjected to sexual abuse without force. So again, even the sexual abuse still going on in 2009. In 2011, the state closed down Dozier and all of the boys that were there were sent to other facilities. In 2012, the state allowed for an anthropology survey to take place by the University of Florida, where they found 55 burials on the grounds, most of which were outside of the cemetery, in the brushland and in the forest area, like in complete unmarked graves. But it is said that there are probably quite a lot more, and I do believe that there were a couple more found after this as well. The state didn't want to exhume any of the bodies. In fact, the state tried to sell up the land dirt cheap as quickly as possible so that they didn't have to deal with it at all. But a family member of one of the children who were at the school that died under very suspicious circumstances managed to get an injunction against the state, and they were no longer allowed to actually sell the land until a survey had taken place and until they'd actually properly looked into what happened there. The state then responded by ordering more work to be done, which include the exhumations of the graves. The first exhumation was that of a 14-year-old boy named George Owen Smith. George had tried to run away from the school in the first few weeks of his stay, and when he was caught, he was undoubtedly beaten, and he wrote home to his mum saying, "I got exactly what I deserved." He was then never heard from again. His mother then wrote to the superintendent asking about her son because she hadn't heard from him, and she was told that her son had run away and they had no idea where he was. So the mother then wrote back to the school saying that she was going to drive up to Mariana and that she was going to search for her son and that she would not leave the school grounds until her son was found. At this point, George had been missing for a total of 4 months. And coincidentally, the day before George's mother was due to arrive at the school, they happened to find his body. He was found apparently underneath a house where he had crawled under and died, they suspect from pneumonia. But this explanation didn't sit right with George's family, and it didn't sit right with a lot of people. One of the students at the school came forward and said that George had actually made a second attempt at running away from the school, and that this student was actually with him when they tried to escape. And they witnessed George running across a field while staff members or guards chased after him, shooting at him with rifles. George's mother instructed for his remains to be sent to the local funeral parlour, but when she arrived in Mariana and came to collect her son's remains, they took her to the school where she was shown a pile of earth and told, "We've already buried him." So George was just buried in an unmarked grave before anything could be done about anything, and it was just left at that. It was found that there was 98 documented deaths at the school between the years of 1911 and 1973. 31 of these boys were buried in the Boot Hill Cemetery. A further 55 graves were found elsewhere in the grounds. And many people think that there are many other bodies and many more boys buried on the grounds, which, to be honest, I'm inclined to believe as well. One of the boys that was actually there in the 60s, he said something that I find a little bit interesting, and I'm going to read it from the laptop. The graveyard called Boot Hill is on the black campus. When I was there, I saw a graveyard on the white campus. I've been told that it was a historic graveyard and that they've never done any kind of ground-penetrating radar there. I feel they do not want to explore the graveyard. I know that there are a lot of boys still buried on that property somewhere in my heart. From the cottage I was in, I could remember seeing that historic graveyard every day, and now, because of the overgrowth, you can't see it at all. I just know there are boys buried in that cemetery. They found boys on top of boys in that Boot Hill cemetery. Anything they can brush off, they're going to. They just don't want to find any more bodies. And I think that that is so true. In January 2016, the University of Florida, they delivered their final report. They managed to make seven DNA matches and a further 14 presumptive identifications, but they are going to continue to try and identify the rest of the remains. It said that there were 3 times as many black students as there were white students that were buried on the grounds. So again, this just proves the point of the black students and the white students were definitely treated differently. In 2009, a further 27 graves are believed to have been identified via ground-penetrating radar, but they are refusing to exhume them. Again, this just proves the point that there are probably a lot more boys buried on those grounds that we don't know about. The men or boys that went through the horrific abuse and exploitation in the school have all been negatively affected by this. Unfortunately, a lot of them went on to live pretty violent lives in and out of prison, doing drugs. They all report being affected by this. Others have said that they have struggled to maintain relationships or even friendships, and the emotional damage that these boys have suffered has stuck with them throughout their entire lives. Now that the school is closed, it is time to put that chapter of history behind us, hopefully learn from it, and I really hope that some of the people have gained closure. While I've been researching this case, I have actually come across quite a lot of schools and hospitals and prison systems that have all got pretty dark histories, which I've been finding a little bit, fascinating, and keep going down these rabbit holes. So if you guys have enjoyed this video and would like me to report on some more things like this, then let me know, because I'd be more than happy to do a series on hospitals, schools and prisons, because yeah, there's quite a few shady things that have been going on in the history. So yeah, and that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new here and you don't know what I do, I tell hardship stories, I tell celebrity stories, everyday people stories, and just stories of general hardship. So if you have a story that you'd like to share or something that you would like me to talk about, you can contact me via my email or my Facebook, which I will leave linked in the description box down below. Otherwise, please subscribe and like this video. It is a free and easy way that you can support this channel. And until next time, please remember to be kind to everybody around you, because you never know what someone else might be going through, and a little bit of kindness and compassion can go a long way. Bye bye for now.